somehow, despite all of the content that I've made over the, well, years at this point about the Jag XK and XKR, I have somehow managed, through the rivals matches, the reviews, the best and worst countdowns, to never actually do a long-term review of the one that I had. I'm not sure how I managed to forget that, but we're finally doing it now, because there are good points, there are not so good points about owning any car. So let's turn my attention now to the XKR, which I had, to give you my thoughts from an owner's perspective in terms of actually living with one of these. Because in the case of mine, it was literally my daily driver. It was the only car I owned at the time, so it was being used for everything. From going to work outside of YouTube, to long trips, to shopping, everything. And of course, fun as well. The one that I had was a 2007, so it was the X150 shape, the aluminium body, with the silver side blades. Mine was, I believe, Santorini black, tan leather, light wood veneers. Initially, I didn't like the veneers. They were kind of IKEA-ish in mine, but they definitely grew on me, and I haven't seen many with those kind of veneers. It had the 20-inch center wheels, I believe it is, which look great on that car. They're my favorite rims. And I did a couple of things to it in the time that I had it. I've done videos on each of those things. I put spacers on the wheels to especially fill out the rear arches a lot more, and the front as well. It was a subtle change, but a great looking one. And of course, most notably, I gave it a quote-unquote muffler delete. It's a back box bypass in more technical terms, where you remove the back box from the car and have straight pipes just for the rear section. It was essentially exactly the same as a stage 1 Adamesh system, so about £400. Gives the car way more bass, a much deeper sound, significantly louder. Some people find that it resonates too much on the motorway. For me, of course, I was a younger owner, still am, so it didn't bother me at all. I loved it. And every time I started the car, it sounded like an Aston Martin Vanquish. So of course I loved it. In terms of actually living with one of these cars, what was it like? What should you look out for? Well, of course, being a 4.2 litre car, it has a different kind of track record when it comes to reliability compared to the 5 litres. I haven't owned a 5 litre myself, so I'm only speaking anecdotally there, but I've heard that they have some timing chain issues, mostly from what I've seen. The 4.2s seem to suffer mostly, in terms of major stuff at least, from cooling hose issues. They'll sometimes need a replacement hose, or one will pop off. You'll see some steam coming out of the intakes on the bonnet, that kind of thing. That seems to be, at least from what I can tell, most of the major stuff. I'm sure there are other things that they're known for as well. In the time that I had mine, the two major things that happened that needed to be fixed were, number one, it had, again, very common squeaky suspension bush on the front left in particular. They do tend to need those looking at after a while, so you can pretty obviously listen out for that while you're driving it. Go over some bumps and potholes, and if you can hear a very loud squeaking, that's usually a sign that it needs to be done. And in the case of mine, interestingly, it had something happen which I don't hear happen that much, and that was that the rear brake lines actually corroded through. Now, that's an age-related thing that can happen to any car, really, but mostly due to salt on the roads, I would imagine. Unfortunately, and fortunately at the same time, it had to be done at the same time that I wanted the exhaust to be done. So to do the brake lines on the back end, we actually had to drop the fuel tank out. And to drop the fuel tank out, you had to remove part of the exhaust. So it was handy that I wanted the exhaust to be changed anyway, otherwise that would have been quite a lot of work just for the sake of putting in new brake lines. It did take a while to get the replacement ones from Jag. They actually sent the wrong ones, so we had to go with different ones, as I recall. It was, of course, a while ago now. But that was the biggest actual issue that the car had, that brake line issue. Aside from that, it's just very small electrical gremlins that you're going to be looking at in terms of daily use. So like a bulb will go here, or you'll have a little electrical issue over there. From my experience, it tends to be, and Jag owners won't like to hear this, but as somebody who's owned both, you can take it from me. They're very similar to owning Maseratis, but in the good way, and that is that most of the issues that you will have tend to be smaller electrical annoyances and gremlins rather than big issues. You can have big issues on any car, but I would say in my experience with both, they tended to be those electrical things, aside from that notable one with the brake lines, which again, that could happen to any number of cars. What about beyond the reliability in terms of using the car? You know, it's a 2+2 GT, so limited boot space, smaller rear seats, maybe harder suspension. What's it like to live with on real roads in that sense? Well, for me, pretty damn good most of the time. As I said, I would drive it quite a lot. Every week I would go back and forth for work outside of YouTube at the time, so I was doing a lot of miles in it. I used to average about 23 to the gallon in my experience, which for me was fine. It is a powerful pretty quick car. That's about 1 mile per gallon more than I would get out of my Maserati Quattroportes, and a heck of a lot more than I get out of my classic American cars now. So for me, it was fine. I think for most people that will be more than enough, because most people tend to use it as more of a toy rather than a daily. But at least if you are going to use it as a daily, that's what you'll be looking at. In terms of space, that is the one thing which I really need to talk about, because the space in particular, I mean, there are two reasons why I moved on from mine, and one of them was the space. Because although it is a 2+2, with these cars in particular, you may as well forget that it is. Because those rear seats, unless you've got very small kids, are next to useless. I had my niece and her boyfriend in the back seats once, and I had to have my seat pushed all the way up to the steering wheel, which must have looked absolutely ridiculous from the outside of the car, and they were still cramped. So it is not practical at all in terms of the rear seats. It's definitely not one of the best 2+2 GT cars in terms of that, and if that is a demand for you rather than just a general requirement, then I would absolutely recommend looking into one of 3 alternate options, one being a BMW 6 Series, the other being a Maserati Gran Turismo, and the third being a risky one, but the Bentley Continental GT. Of those 3, I would actually say take a look at a Maserati. The Gran Turismo is a superb 2+2 in terms of space, and a really damn good car. And driving one of those is actually what made me get 2 more Quattroportes, even though my first one was not a good experience. So, speaks volumes to how good they are. For now though, I would say that the rear seats are an immediate drawback. You'll notice that very quickly. Think of it as just a parcel shelf, really. You could even, if you wanted to modify your XK, maybe like Porsche 911 GT3 style the back, take the seats out and put in a crossbar or a roll cage, depends how extreme you want to go. The second thing when it comes to space is the good thing, and that is driver space. And when I say driver, I mean both of the front seats. You can fit in one of these X150s if you're pretty tall. I mean, I'm 6'3", I fit in the car fine. I would have the seat down, back, recline it a bit, and I would have all the space I needed. In fact, most of the cars that I've had, pretty much out of necessity, have always been good for space. I haven't owned a car that wasn't, from a Golf to a Touareg to a Lincoln, big and small. These are great for that. And of course, if you have a convertible, doubtless that's going to be even better, at least with the roof down. But suffice it to say, even with a hardtop, if you are a taller driver, you should be okay. Whether you're long torso or long leg, either way, you'll be good. And as you can tell from some of my older reviews, some footage of which you'll see here, I weighed a lot more back then. In fact, back when these videos were made, I think I weighed probably 50 kilos more than I do now. So even back then, at, I don't know what I was, 23, 24 stone at the time of those reviews, I could still fit in the car just fine. So that is something to bear in mind. The third thing about space is another one which is a little bit of a middle ground. I don't think most people will find this to be an issue. For me, it was more of one because of using it as a daily, and that is the boot. See, one of the things that I immediately liked about these X150s is that the boot looks quite big. It's very wide, it's very deep, and it's got a nice big open surface area. Perfect for potentially, going golfing. You should be able to fit clubs in there. I don't play, so I wouldn't know for sure, but it looks like you could. But that's the thing. See, the boot is wide and it is long, but it's not very deep. So if you put in actual bags into the boot, it will get full more quickly than you'd think. So if you are transporting a lot of luggage, that's when you might fall into some issues. So if you are using it as a touring vehicle, if there's 2 of you, then that's fine, because you've got the rear seats and the boot. So it's only really if you need 4 passengers, or if you're going to have an inordinate amount of luggage to take, or just really awkwardly shaped stuff, that's when you'll notice the strange shape of the boot. Kind of Aston Martin-esque. They have a similar issue in terms of how they're shaped, but not an issue which I think most people will run into anyway. The next thing I want to talk about is the ride, the handling, the suspension, the steering, the manners, the personality, everything, comfort, all the way down to performance. I would say that these X150s are, in particular, significantly improved over the outgoing cigar-shaped cars, the X100s, in this way in particular. They feel like they have a much lower centre of gravity, they feel much wider and longer and more squat, much more of a supercar kind of stance, rather than a tall GT Tourer, and I think they benefit from that immensely. You can throw these things through corners. The front end is incredibly precise. It almost feels like the engine is front mid-mounted, almost in the cabin. It feels that far back, and you can just throw them through corners. In terms of whether or not it's comfortable, well, that's a very personal thing. I would say that these X150s, at least in the case of mine, and I've driven quite a few at this point, they definitely err more on the side of harder suspension rather than bouncy. I would say that the older cars, the torpedo shape X100s, they're definitely softer, and it's one of the things I don't like about those as much. They're a bit too bouncy, at least with standard suspension. These ones don't really have that. For some people, I think they might find that too harsh. If you are accustomed to something like a Maserati, maybe like a 911, you'll be totally fine. For you, it will probably be at least as good as those, if not a step up. If you're coming from something like a Bentley, well, then of course you're going to notice a difference. But generally speaking, I would say that they are comfortable enough. Not remarkably good, and certainly not bad. They're just about as comfortable as they need to be for a GT car. Now, for full exposure, of course, earlier on I mentioned a couple of reasons why I moved on from mine. Now, that wasn't because of any reliability issues or maintenance or anything like that. It certainly wasn't any more or less expensive than any other performance car I've owned, I wouldn't say, overall. But the reason why I moved on was, first of all, because of the rear seats being next to useless for me, and a two-seater, as cool as it is, I just feel like I want more than that. I guess I've kind of gone to the other extreme now, where one of my cars has 6 seats and the other one has 10, so I've definitely got plenty of seats. But that was one of the primary reasons, that especially coupled with the boot space. I think for many people, if you know what you're getting into, especially if you come from another sports car, you'll be fine. You won't care at all if you've already dailied a sports car and been fine with it. If anything, it'll be a step up from that. Secondly, though, I just, as I've said before, like to change my vehicles quite often anyway. Even if I've got the best car in the world or my dream car, I'll probably still move on from it eventually because I like to try new stuff. I don't see the point of owning one car forever when you might find something else that you like even more. And even if you don't, it doesn't matter, because variety is the spice of life. So that's why I got rid of mine and moved on from it. And ultimately, I don't feel like I'm going to get another XKR probably anytime soon. I feel like if I ever did dip my toe back into the Jaguar sphere, it would more likely be with an XJR or an XFR, because those are different. Whereas with the XKR, I feel like in the time that I had it, I pretty much got everything that I wanted out of the car. And because of the requirements that I do have in terms of the practicality and space side of things, it wouldn't make too much sense for me to go back into one of those. So ultimately, that's it for my thoughts on the long-term experience with an XKR, a 4.2 X150 shape in particular, from 2007, as I said. And of course, I would love to hear your stories and thoughts down below. Maybe even if you bought an XK or an XKR because of my videos, especially then, I would love to know how it's turned out for you. Even if it maybe wasn't so good, did you stick with it? Did you get a different one? Did you move on entirely to something new? And of course, if you are considering one, be sure to check out those comments as well for the advice and experiences of other people. If you're new to the channel, of course, I've done a ton of other XK content, plenty of that to check out. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.